Hello and welcome to the Truth Legal Podcast with me, Andrew Gray. During this podcast series, I interview people, usually lawyers, who may be of interest to the tens of thousands of people who consume our Truth Legal content every month. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to have with me, via Skype podcast, an Uber-type barrister, the first that I have spoken to. I have Ann Crighton with me. Hello, Ann. How are you?
Good morning, Andrew. I'm very well, thank you.
Great. Let's just kick off. You describe yourself as a self-employed Uber-type barrister. I've never heard anyone describe themselves as that. Could you explain to my listeners what on earth that is?
A one-stop barrister. In the old days, you had to go to, if you wanted to employ a barrister to go and represent you at court, you had to go to a solicitor. That solicitor would take instructions from you. But The solicitor didn't represent you in court. The solicitor then instructed a barrister to represent you in court. Now, there were two downsides there. One is that's very expensive because you're paying both a solicitor and a barrister. The other downside to that could be that you meet the barrister at court, you've never met that barrister before, and that barrister might have had to pick up the case at the last moment and not necessarily have a detailed knowledge of your case.
That is very common in civil law as well as criminal, I guess. So you get round that by, I assume, being there from the start to the finish. Is that right?
Right, from the very beginning. So somebody will ring me up and I'll take some basic instructions and give them advice as to whether they've got a case or not. I do not take on hopeless cases. I know of firms of solicitors that will speak to people charged with drink driving and tell them that they have got a defence to it. It'll involve 2 or 3 court appearances, i.e. they'll instruct a barrister to go to court 2 or 3 times. They'll then go to trial, and as expected, the trial will probably be lost. So the client gets a longer ban, probably a bigger fine, has to pay more costs and so on. But the solicitors will have charged £8,000.
Ouch.
So they're in profit. They've not lost anything, but the client has. I'm not like that because I am looking to build up a good reputation. So if I think that somebody hasn't got a chance, that's exactly what I'll tell them.
I could tell you're someone who calls a spade, and I've only got speaking to you 20 minutes before we recorded this podcast, and I really like your style. It's very, if I may say so, unbarristery. It's not pretentious. There's no sort of fluff with it. It's to the point. And I like that. I'm sure your clients like it very much.
They do.
I bet.
I represented one of my clients. If you look on my website, you'll see I've got all 5-star reviews. And one of my clients wrote, it was a plasterer, looking at a band, better call Ann.
You should get that on your car, on the livery on your car. Now, Ann, let's talk about your career as a lawyer, because it is incredibly unusual. You've done legal executory, solicitor with high rights, and now barrister. I've never met anyone who's gone through that trajectory. Would you explain to my listeners your sort of career in law, how it's taken you and how you've ended up where you are today?
I left school at 16 and did a secretarial course. I then went travelling for a few years. Eventually, I got a job as a secretary in a legal department. First the Treasury solicitors and then Wimpey's, the builders. And then I went to work for a firm of solicitors in the West End. And the solicitor that I was working for, she became very ill. So the senior partner asked me to do as much of her work as possible. And then he paid me overtime to stay with him at night and go through the work, and he would tell me what to do. And the clients quite liked me. So I decided I would go to night school and get some qualifications. So I went to night school and I qualified as a fellow of the Institute of Legal Executives. But all the time I just kept passing the exams. So then I decided to do the outstanding exams in order to become a solicitor. So I had the equivalent of a law degree. And then I had to take a year out and go to law school to do the Law Society finals. The intention being to do conveyancing, because that's what I'd been doing up until then. But the minute I qualified, the bottom fell out of the property market.
And conveyancing's rather dull, if I may say so as well. And it's not criminal law, is it?
I enjoyed it. I had a lot of Irish clients, and I'm from an Irish background, and I quite enjoyed it. But I met somebody that had a job at the CPS and it sounded interesting. So I wrote to them and asked them if I could job shadow a prosecutor. And I decided that I really liked it. And then I got a casual contract with them and I stayed there for 20 years.
Could you explain to my listeners what the CPS is? Not everyone will be familiar with the term. Most people will, but not everybody. So could you explain how the CPS functions, where it sits in relation to the state and the police, etc.?
Right. The police collect evidence and then they'll send the case to the CPS, and the CPS lawyers look at it to see whether there is enough evidence for there to be a realistic prospect of conviction, but also whether or not it's in the public interest to prosecute a particular person.
Thank you. And that's where you were for, say, 20 years?
Yeah.
And what sort of matters were you dealing with when you were at the CPS? I imagine most types in that duration.
Everything from no insurance to murder. Because initially, when I started at the CPS, which would have been more than 25 years ago now, I was the lawyer that dealt with Ealing Police Station. So I dealt with just about everything that came out of Ealing Police Station. And then I went to Ealing Court and prosecuted the cases. And it would be 3 days in court and 2 days in the office and the other way around the following week, which I actually thought was quite a good system. I don't like the system that they've got now at all. It's layers of management.
Yes. So are there any cases that you could tell us about that you worked on? If you dealt with murder cases, perhaps some of my listeners will have known of some of those cases you worked on. I mean, maybe you can't talk about them for sort of privacy confidential reasons, but if you can, please expand.
Well, that would have been a long time ago, because as the CPS went on, they set up specialist departments. So they'd have a traffic department, they'd have a fraud department, they'd have a department that just dealt with murders. Back in the day when I started off, we dealt with everything. One case that I dealt with, I became a youth specialist at one point. Well, I was a youth specialist for about 10 years. And one case I dealt with, which I thought was interesting, was a woman that left her house to make a phone call. And I think she was probably an alcoholic. She was very drunk anyhow. And the next day she discovered that she had been attacked and raped, but she had no recollection of it. Whether it was the shock of it, whether it was the fact she was so drunk, I really don't know. But we did a lot of work with the CPS, with the police, and tracked down a lot of CCTV. And eventually 2 15-year-olds were convicted of raping her, even though she had no recollection of it at all.
Goodness gracious me. What's it like to work on cases of such disgustingness, for want of a better word? I mean, do you need counselling after dealing with them, or are you just incredibly robust and you can handle it? I mean, do you see danger everywhere that you go? I mean, how does the mind of the CPS lawyer work?
No, I don't. But as I say, as time went on, they set up specialist units. So they have a unit now that just deals with, it's called the RASO unit, Rape and Sexual Offences Unit. So I think the lawyers that work in that unit that constantly deal with sexual offences, particularly offences that involve small children,
yes,
I think they get affected by it after a while.
I can believe it. Now, during your time in the CPS, I understand you became the national convener, which I think is probably the most senior sort of representative or trade union representative of the CPS. Is that right?
I did indeed.
Okay. Why? Why do lawyers need trade unions?
Probably the reason that I ended up as a trade union representative. Young children, you often hear them saying, that's not fair. They hate unfairness.
Yes.
And I don't think I ever really grew up in that respect. I do not like seeing people treated unfairly. And I'm afraid I saw quite a bit of that in the CPS, and I felt the need to help people.
Surely that made you incredibly unpopular with management.
Yeah. Yes. I took voluntary redundancy and I got a very quick package.
No doubt. I can believe it. I was a trade union representative myself at a trade union law firm. So we have something in common there. And yes, you don't always make friends with management by pushing for your members, which you feel very strongly about, and as I did. I think I tried arranging a strike when I was at a trade union law firm, and yes, wasn't successful. So let's talk about your trajectory or sort of movement into being a self-employed barrister. So you were a solicitor for many years. How did you end up becoming a barrister? The route is, I think, a bit convoluted, is it not?
No,
Okay.
I was a solicitor with higher court rights. I was one of the first higher court advocates.
Could you explain that for me? What does that mean? But not everyone will understand that.
No, they won't. In the old days, only barristers had rights of audience in the Crown Court.
Okay.
So solicitors had to instruct barristers because they didn't have any rights of audience. Round about the year 2000, the law changed and solicitors could, with appropriate experience, acquire higher court rights. And therefore, they were allowed to appear in the Crown Court. Because of that, if you are a solicitor with higher court rights, the bar are quite welcoming, really. They're happy for you to transfer over and become a barrister because I suppose solicitors with higher court rights compete with them and they'd rather have them as barristers. So that meant I didn't have to take pupillage. So I just had to basically satisfy the Bar Council that I was a fit and proper person and I had the relevant experience and write a few checks and I became a barrister.
And when did you qualify as a barrister then?
I'm just having a look on my wall now because I've got a certificate on the wall.
I'm glad it's not seared into your consciousness. You know,
No.
It doesn't define you. You're
No,
just a human.
2015, and I think that's because I acquired my higher court rights in 2000. And at the CPS, whether you're a solicitor or a barrister, you basically do the same work. So to me, there's not a great difference.
Got it. In my world, in the civil law world, I think there is quite a significant difference actually. But I'm glad that it's more morphed in your world. Talk to me about your business, the types of clients you have, the types of works you do, which courts you find yourselves in. Explain to my listeners how you roll.
Initially, I joined a chambers, so I would be instructed by CPS or firms of solicitors. And the solicitors that I was taking instructions from basically doing motoring offences. So I gained quite a bit of expertise in doing motoring offences. But it then struck me, why are the clients paying the solicitors £1, £2, £3, £4,000 and they're paying me, say, £300 when the client would be better off coming directly to me and I'd earn twice as much and the client would be paying less than half.
It's a no-brainer, really, if you put it like that.
Yeah, it is. So I work from home and generally speaking, if I can, the clients come and see me at home. But if necessary, we'll do a conference on Skype or over the phone or I'll travel to meet them.
And which courts have you found yourself in since you went solo?
Mainly London courts, but, I can just as easily be in Stevenage, Southend. I've even been up to Liverpool. So I'm quite flexible.
I can see. What my listeners might appreciate is your fees, what you charge, are crystal clear, front and centre on your website. And although barristers and solicitors' fees are always expensive, when I looked at yours, I thought, you know what, they look really right. That's what it ought to be. That's not obscene like it can be. Could you explain to my listeners roughly what it is you charge for various types of offences, please?
For example, you've got 9 points on your driving license and you pick up another speeding ticket for, say, driving 26 miles an hour in a 20 mile per hour zone. If those 9 points have been acquired in the last 3 years, then you will be called to court because you'll be looking at becoming a totter. What that means, if you get 12 points, then you will be disqualified for 6 months, disqualified from driving, that is. And to make this quite simple, the only way you can get out of it really is by pleading exceptional hardship. And that's quite a high bar because there's a House of Lords case which says loss of employment is not enough for exceptional hardship. However, there's other case law which says hardship that's caused to other people could be enough for exceptional hardship. So if you were in that situation and you were looking at losing your license for 6 months and you had employees, young children, for whatever reason, completely dependent on you being able to drive, then if you wanted to instruct me to go to court and put forward an exceptional hardship argument for you, I would charge a flat fee of £600, which I have to say is very reasonable because I'll take instructions usually in person. You'll come and sit down with me and we'll go through everything. And I'll type up a proof of evidence for you and make sure that I've got my facts exactly right. And then I'll go to court and appear for you and argue your case, hopefully successfully.
Got it. Are you able to say what your success rate is? I mean, I'm not sure what my firm's success rate is for what we do, but do you happen to know what it is for yours? And I imagine you don't know, but if you happen to know it, I'd love to hear it.
I don't know. I mean, I would say that I'm successful 95% of the time. I really would.
Good. Well done you then.
But I don't collect statistics, so it's hard to know. But I do see other firms of solicitors that claim that they are successful 98% of the time. But I know in my heart that is not true, because if you look at the magistrates' court statistics,
yes,
then most people, if they've got the opportunity, go to the Crown Court because there's a very high conviction rate in the magistrates' court. So I don't necessarily believe what some firms of solicitors say about their success rates. And I think you can make statistics say all sorts of things. So to be honest, I don't collect my stats.
Thank you, Anne. Changing tack somewhat. Can you explain to me, because I genuinely don't know why it's okay to use hands-free on your mobile and ask your car to call your wife, your partner, whatever, but it isn't okay to actually just use your mobile phone when it's okay to use your radio and so on. So could you explain to me where, the law around this area? Is it strict liability? If so, what is strict liability? Just explain to everybody the law on mobile phones versus anything else and what strict liability means.
No, it's not strict liability.
Okay. My mistake as a lawyer. So educate me and educate my listeners.
You're quite right. If you're driving along and having a conversation using Bluetooth, you're not committing an offence. If you are driving along and your phone is in your hand and you're using your phone for an interactive communication, then you are committing an offence, even if you're not moving in your car. However, there's been a recent High Court case on this very subject.
Okay.
Because the law is quite old-fashioned and I think it's probably going to have to be amended. If you have the phone in your hand and you're using it for an interactive communication, that means reading a text or sending a text or making a phone call, receiving a phone call. But this case went to the High Court and it was a man that used his phone whilst he was driving along to take pictures of an accident. So he was using the phone as a camera, and the High Court held that because he wasn't using it for an interactive communication, he was not guilty of the offence. They could have charged him with not being in proper control, which carries 3 points, but they didn't. So also, if you use your phone, for example, to listen to audiobooks that you've already downloaded or music, that's not an interactive communication either. Neither is it using your phone as a sat-nav. So it's quite technical. And I've got a couple of friends that do similar work than me, and we have lots of boring conversations about the technicalities of interactive communication. But the idea is, what is an offence? If you have a phone in your hand and you use it to scratch your head, that's clearly not an interactive communication. Listening to downloaded music, that's not an interactive communication. As you say, it's the same as a radio. So it's only an offence, basically, if you're sending a text or making a phone call.
That's very interesting. So this has blown my mind, because I always thought it was just almost touching your phone. If I looked at the clock on my phone, I would be committing an offence and therefore not to do it. So in interactive communication, you stumped me there, actually. I really is news to me. Is that commonly known in the world that is the case? Because I think most people think just touching their phone almost is, it's a nuclear reactor in a car once the car is moving. Is that well known, Anne?
Not at all. That's why police officers charge people with driving whilst using a mobile phone, and I managed to get cases kicked out.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, as you should. Oh, thank you for that. I was wondering as well, Anne, about your opinion on speed limits. So obviously in Germany they have the famous autobahns where you can travel at the speed of light, and it seems to be okay for you to do that. And so they say, the German roads are safer. Obviously we have 70 miles an hour zone, and good luck getting 70 miles an hour on the M25 at any point in time. What's your thoughts on the speeds that we have in the UK? Because cars seem to be getting better. I think their technology is improving. Motor deaths are diminishing, even though car usage is high. But are our speed limits set at the right level, in your humble opinion?
That's difficult. Where I live, they've reduced the speed limit to 20 miles per hour on virtually all the roads in Hammersmith and Fulham.
Okay.
And I believe they're even thinking of introducing a 15 mile per hour speed limit in the city. You can't argue with the fact that speed kills, and there is a reason for speed limits. However, I do think sometimes that it's just a revenue raising exercise. I think I mentioned to you before a case that I dealt with. It was a taxi driver driving at 26 miles per hour in a 20 mile per hour zone in South London. Now, you've got to bear in mind, when the legislation was introduced back in 1988, there were probably about 10% of speed cameras than there are now. There's speed cameras on most roads, I would say, and lots of people get caught out with variable speed limits as well. But I'll come back to that. Here is a situation that I do not think is fair. So the man was driving at 26 miles per hour in a 20 mile per hour zone in South London. He wasn't familiar with the area, and he was taking a passenger to hospital. So he got a ticket, and he went to court on his own because he had some speeding points on his license, all low-level speeding, for which he'd immediately paid the fine and taken the points. And those points had fallen off his license on the date he went to court. But when he got to court, he found out that it goes from date of offence to date of offence. It's another reason why it's worth getting legal advice when you get involved with traffic offences. So they said, right, that means another 3 points. You are a totter. You are disqualified for 6 months. I only dealt with the appeal, but on the appeal, I put forward he was the only breadwinner in the family. He had a disabled wife, 3 children, one of whom was disabled. He lived in a rented house, and they were in danger of losing their home because the whole family had no income bar the disability allowance or personal allowance, whatever they call it these days. And I think in the end, he ended up, because the appeal was successful, because the magistrates had refused to lift the ban pending the result of the appeal, he'd been disqualified for 56 days. So he'd lost nearly 2 months' money, and that affected the whole family. And I think that's a bit much for driving at 26 miles an hour.
I do. I mean, my firm does deal with a lot of personal injury claims which emanate from road traffic situations where often speed is the deciding factor. But you're right, 26 and a 20 about to lose your license and you're home over it seems extreme to me. Yeah. And I can tell that from this podcast and our prior conversation that the streak of fairness is as alive in you as a child as it is today, which is really reassuring. People need to hear that lawyers get moved by stuff and get angry. And I encourage our lawyers here, in a sense, to be angry and to be passionate. And the moment that you become anaesthetized to a situation, you're not upset about it, or you think, oh, well, who cares about fairness? I think that's the time that you're in the wrong job, in the wrong profession. Now, change of tack again. Do you do legal aid matters, Anne?
No, I don't.
Why not?
There's several reasons why I don't do legal aid. One is the kind of work I do, and because I'm on my own, I get fixed dates for trials. If I get involved in general criminal work in the Crown Court, then I'll go on warned lists, and all of a sudden I'll be told your case is in court tomorrow. I just cannot operate my business in that way. It's about time that the Crown Courts modernised and had fixed dates for trials. I could say an awful lot about the Ministry of Justice. I think I would call them the Ministry of Injustice. When I think about the fact that I was there 20 years ago when Hammersmith Court opened, it was a purpose-built court. It was a very busy court. And the Ministry of Justice have sold that court just so that they can use the money to pay millions to consultants. It makes me so angry. because the people in Hammersmith and Fulham now have to travel, I can't remember the name of the place they go to, not Hayes or somewhere like that, miles away to a court.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the Ministry of Justice, isn't it? I mean, the
Yeah.
courts are slower than they ever have been in my lifetime. Particularly the London courts are, months, if not years, behind. In terms of employment tribunals and county courts and so on, the speed of process is so slow. You could be on the phone for half an hour, and then the phone's then slammed down on you. You're thinking, oh my goodness, I don't need to help my client here, and you have to ring again. You're on the phone for another half an hour for the phone to be put down on you. It's an absolute disgrace.
Now, I've just remembered the court that people have to go to in Hammersmith and Fulham is Hendon, which is more than 10 miles away, and there isn't even a tube station there. So most people that end up in court, ignoring my traffic clients, the vast majority of people that end up in court for general crimes are poor, or they've got mental health difficulties, and sometimes both. And I just do not understand how the Ministry of Justice expect these people to get from Hammersmith and Fulham to Hendon when there isn't even a tube station there. It is utterly ridiculous. And the youths now are going to Highbury and Islington, presumably so they can, fight on the way. They can have some postcode wars or something. I could moan at length about the Ministry of Justice. The amount of money that's spent on consultants is just sickening. And the state of the courts is just sickening, and it has to be bad because even the judges are complaining.
Yes, they are. Austerity has hit the Ministry of Justice heavily. It's impacted upon access to justice big time. And I bang my drum about it on the Truth Legal blog a great deal, but it unfortunately just isn't a vote winner for any of the parties, as far as I can see, and probably never will be. I think often people think that it's the lawyers are self-interested and want to earn more money. It's not like that at all. We want our clients to have their day in court efficiently, quickly, with the right outcome, and I'm just not seeing that in most areas.
No, I'll give you an example. One of my clients is a young man, clean driving license, no previous convictions. He has a very good defence. So I wrote to the court and I entered his not guilty plea, asked for his attendance to be excused, sent it in the post. I sent it by email. I got an acknowledgement. And the next thing he heard is he'd been found guilty in his absence.
Wow.
It took me 4 months to get somebody to look at that and get that conviction overturned. And so I think I've got his trial next week. But the whole thing's been going on about a year now.
It's a disgrace, and a poor man to get that through the post and then have all that drama, uncertainty, and so on before you for essentially just an administrative error at the courts is a real shame.
And I've got a client coming to see me this afternoon, exactly the same thing, and he's distressed. He's got quite a senior job. He's never had anything to do with the courts before, and he said, "Anne, I thought I was going for trial. I've got 6 points on my licence and an £800 fine. How?" So I've had to explain to him that, I've had to write in, ask for the matter to be opened under Section 142, reopened in the interests of justice. But you would think that because the courts made a mistake, that they would reopen that case as quickly as possible. But I got an acknowledgement to my email saying that it'll be looked at within the next 5 days. But there's a paragraph at the bottom saying, if you want your case reopened under Section 142, please recognise there's a huge backlog. Thank you.
Dear.
Thank you.
You couldn't make it up. Now, Anne, do you have any tips for individuals who aren't using solicitors and they're not using barristers, they're doing it themselves, about to be convicted of some sort of motoring offence and they're going to court for the first time? Do you have any sort of top tips, 5 tips, hot tips, etc., to help them out on this difficult day for them?
It is a very difficult day for them. I would say, the very least, if you ring somebody like me, I will give advice over the phone free of charge. I'll even have people come and meet me, and again, it will be a free consultation. And I do that because most people, once they've had a conversation with me, think, actually, it's a good idea to pay her and be represented, because they realise it is quite technical and it's very difficult to mitigate for yourself if you've not been in court before. And most of my clients haven't been in court before. Tips, well, these days, if you know you're guilty, then you should plead guilty at the first opportunity, because then they'll reduce the fine and it gets rid of the stress. But if you're going to bring references, it's a good idea to bring character references to court.
And how would it? So you get character reference maybe from a landlord, an employer, someone who's sort of got stature in the community. What should a reference say? Generally speaking,
that you're honest, decent, hardworking person. This is completely out of character. Responsible member of the community, that kind of thing. Been having a hard time because you've got a relative in hospital dying. It depends on the personal circumstances.
And people must remember that in the magistrates, the members or the people, so the magistrates themselves, they aren't legally qualified. These are just, they're just human beings that are guided, I think, by a clerk. Could you explain how the magistrates work? Because I'm not entirely sure, and I imagine most people aren't who are listening to this podcast.
Okay. When you go to court, in the magistrates' court, you will either be in front of a district judge, and they are legally qualified. They have to have been a solicitor or barrister for at least 7 years. It's quite a sought-after job. So they'll be very experienced. They'll know the law. And to be honest, I think they deal with things far quicker. For obvious reasons, with magistrates, they don't know the law. They have to be advised by a legal advisor who will be a solicitor or a barrister. And then they have to go out and discuss their findings between them. So, to be honest, I don't know that it saves any money at all to have magistrates in court, because the courts will take far longer than if they had a district judge.
Surely, isn't it better to have, from a justice point of view, 3 people deciding on your fate rather than one judge who may or may not have been doing it for a number of years and perhaps is a little worn out by the process? I don't know. Is there anything in that argument that magistrates are sort of like jurors? They're sort of one of us sort of thing, and they're more likely to be swayed, not necessarily by legal argument, by sort of moral fairness types arguments. Is there anything in that?
No, because they're not representative of the community at all. They're people like me, actually. They're normally 50 or 60 years of age, quite often retired, quite wealthy people, because not many people, if they're working full time, can get the time off work to go and sit and be a magistrate. And often, despite getting legal advice from legal advisors, and some of the advice they get from legal advisors I'm not at all sure about, they can get the law wrong. And I always say to clients, look, we've got magistrates. I don't know what they're like. It's a Wild West show.
Yeah.
I didn't say that.
Pay your money, you take your chances, sort of thing, or maybe you don't pay your money and you do take your chances. Got you. Now, do you have any tips for budding lawyers? Should they just go to university, study law, and become a solicitor or a barrister and make as much money as they possibly can? Or are there other ways of doing it? Are there any sort of values that people should hold if they wanted to become a lawyer? Just general advice. I know you've got a 17-year-old son. If he wanted to become a lawyer and you probably put him off, what would you have said to him?
Well, I did suggest, because he likes arguing with me, I did suggest to him that he might consider becoming a solicitor or barrister. And his answer was, no, thank you, too much like hard work. And that's true. It is hard work. It's very competitive. But I would say if you are an ordinary person and you wanted to become a barrister specialising in family law or criminal law, think very carefully. It's going to cost you about £70,000 to qualify. You have your university fees where you get your law degree. You then have to do the bar finals course, which I believe is about £25,000 now. They automatically fail 25% of the people. This is a privately run company. If you do manage to get through university and the bar finals, you then have to try and find pupillage. And about half of the barristers simply won't find pupillage. There's not enough places for them. Once you've got through all that, certainly with criminal work and family work, you'll find these chambers will send you off all over the country to do jobs for very little money. Or sometimes they'll even do it free of charge for solicitors because they want the big briefs. So the young barrister gets very little or no money, having been put up to their ears in debt. And then even if they do get paid, they'll wait months, if not years, for their bills to be settled. So really, it's gone back to the old days as far as being a barrister is concerned. It's the rich boys game.
I have to agree. Now, you might not know, but Truth Legal, my firm, has a very good and long-standing relationship with United Voices, the World Trade Union in London, and they are primarily represented migrant workers, usually in the cleaning profession. And more recently, the United Voices of the World, they've opened a branch for lawyers, predominantly for criminal barristers, because of all those things that you've explained, that criminal barristers may get paid less than the minimum wage to do
They
their
do.
work, and they have debts which are just mind-blowing. And as a result, as you say, it becomes a posh person's profession
Yep.
when it really shouldn't be. It should be open to all, and it's getting it's more difficult than it ever should be. It's obscene in 2019 that is happening at all. To pay less than minimum wage, but also to put ordinary or anybody of a normal background becoming a criminal barrister, I worry for us all, because those criminal barristers then become the judges, don't they, for in like 20, 30 years' time. So
Yes.
it's skewing society for decades,
Yep.
just by some sort of silly budgetary cuts.
It's a bit like the prime ministers that we get now.
Yeah.
How many have been to Eton, that kind of thing.
Exactly. That's a fair point. Now, Anne, as we could get to the end of the podcast, do you have any messages you want to have for my listeners? How are they going to find you? Is it on Twitter? Do they text you, WhatsApp you, website? How would you like people to get in touch with you?
If you just Google Crichton Chambers, CRIGHTON, then my website will come up. And as you say, my pricing's quite clear. And you'll see all my Google reviews, which I'm proud of. And I think certainly in London, if you type in things like no insurance, my name will come up. The problem I've got is I get people through advertising, but the big firms that will charge them thousands, they can invest far more in Google advertising. So if you type in drink driving, they'll come up top of the list.
And this is why we're doing this podcast, to allow people to get to know you better, to understand what makes you tick. They might not like the cut of your jib, but I suspect that everybody will who's listening to this. You're very straightforward to deal with. I like your opinionated stances. I agree with you wholeheartedly about the Ministry of Justice. I agree with you about the obscene charges that there are for dealing with some matters which are quite straightforward. And I'm just delighted that you've taken the opportunity to have the podcast with me. We never met each other. Perhaps we will next time down in London. And I wish you absolutely all the best with your firm and pursuing justice and fairness for everybody. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you.